Okay. Welcome everyone to the Collegiate Peaks Forum Series. I'm Kelly Collins. I'm the president of the board of this organization, whose mission is to bring lectures in philosophy, spirituality, and science to the Arkansas River Valley. And I am very pleased to welcome you to our last lecture of 2020 season with Temple Grandin. Thank you to our sponsors and contributors. You're the folks that keep us going. And the way that this is going to proceed is we'll have an introduction of Temple by Rebecca Poos, another board member. Please put your questions in the chat and Temple will respond to them when she's done with her lecture. Please do keep your mute button on and your photo off and your cell phones on silent. With that, I'd like to ask Rebecca to go ahead with the introduction.
All right, welcome everyone. We're so excited to have you here. I'll just give a quick, I first heard of Temple Grandin years ago and my brother started telling me about this woman who was writing these incredible books about seeing in pictures and thinking in pictures. And I was very intrigued by that and also love animals. So I listened to Animals Make Us Human on my commute for a few weeks, was also totally fascinated by all that. And in 2011, we were thinking of speakers that would be perfect for our forum series and invited Temple, and she came to Buena Vista. We talked on the phone. I'll never forget, Temple. You said, I don't have to drive over Independence Pass, do I? You did not want to drive over Independence Pass.
Never again. Never again. I was so scared. There's no way. I went maybe over 2 hours, long way around to get out of doing that.
I understand. So Temple stayed at our house and we had a delightful visit together and still have pictures of you holding our puppy Buckwheat on your lap. We had 2 lectures in that event and packed the high school gym in Buena Vista. It was the best attended lecture we'd ever had in the history of the Collegiate Peaks Forum series. The first night was on autism and the second morning was on animals. And Temple has brought so much in both those worlds of interest and important insights to us all. And we heard her recently speak on NPR about how people were learning during COVID and how that was really being challenging for some maybe kids on the spectrum. Learning online was being especially difficult. So we thought, let's have Temple come again, and maybe she'll come on Zoom if she doesn't have to drive over the mountain passes and share with us more learnings and exciting things. And I also just want to encourage everybody, if you haven't seen the movie that came out in 2010, I believe.
Yeah, that's right.
That HBO movie with Claire Danes, it's fascinating. And I watched it again recently and learned a lot more. So Temple, we're just tickled that we reached out and you answered and that you're here with us tonight. And Clark and I are wearing our Rock Mount shirts in honor of Temple's fashion choice over the years. And thank you for joining us for the Collegiate Peaks Forum series. We're excited to hear what you have to share with us.
Well, thank you very much. And I guess one of you is going to change my slides when I indicate. Well, what I want to get you thinking about is you look at Michelangelo here. What would happen to him in today's educational system? He was a 6th grade dropout. He could read, he could write, do basic math. His parents were not in favor of art. But when he was young, he was exposed to it because all the cathedrals around were doing great art. And he also was brought up with stone cutter tools, so that he also got exposed to the tools of the trade. We can go on to the next slide. But the thing I want you to think about is, where would he be today? Einstein didn't have any speech till age 4 or so. Well, where would he be? He'd probably be in special ed. Now, people can argue as to whether or not he's autistic or not, but he definitely would have been in special ed with that kind of speech delay. And you sometimes get some kids that are smart in math at a young age, and people don't think to expose them to math. And there's all kinds of great stuff online for learning math, like Wolfram Mathematica, code.org for learning programming. Steve Jobs was bullied in school. He was a bit different. You want to look at some interesting videos. You might want to look at the Bill Gates deposition videos, the antitrust depositions. He rocks during them when he's asked the hard questions about killing Netscape. Then he starts going like this. Yeah, you see a little bit of autism. Might give you an Einstein or Michelangelo or Steve Jobs. You get too much autism, you get really severe disability. And I found an interesting paper called Solitary Mammals as a Model for Autism. So if you look at the big cat family, like lions, for example, they are more social than tigers and leopards. Tigers and leopards live a more solitary life. There's genetic crossover with autism. Well, if the lions are doing the diagnosing, then the leopards would be considered defective then. It's a continuous trait. It is a continuous trait. And a brain can either be more thinking or a brain can be more social emotional. And a certain amount of this is normal variation. And then, of course, you get somebody who never learns to speak with other problems. Yes, you've got a really severe disability. Let's go on to the next slide. Thomas Edison, he was labeled a hyperactive high school dropout. Fortunately, his parents homeschooled him. He grew up in a world of books. What I'm seeing happening to a lot of kids that are different today is just getting addicted to video games. So what's going on with kids with COVID now having to stay home? I think on little kids, it's really difficult. One thing I found for myself is I got to get up in the morning, get dressed, have a shower, all that stuff, and not be slouching around in pajamas. That's just not, that doesn't work very well. In fact, I'm working on a new book right now on visual thinking and why visual thinking is really important in a lot of fields. We can go on to the next slide. What about Jane Goodall? When she did her famous study, she had a 2-year secretarial degree. Would she be able to pull that off today? Now, one of the places where we've got a huge shortage right now is skilled trades. Plumbers, electricians, people to fix the electrical wires, diesel mechanics, auto mechanics, and welders that can read drawings. And those jobs be COVID-proof and recession-proof. We can go to the next slide. Steven Spielberg is dyslexic, bullied in school, and what saved him was his childhood movie camera. He got exposed to making movies when he was really young. Well, look where he went. Let's go to the next slide. All right, this is one of my most important slides. This is the different kinds of minds. And I am an object visualizer. Everything I think about, it's a picture. And the HBO movie showed very clearly how I think in pictures. Now, I absolutely couldn't do algebra. I managed to get out of algebra. I'm seeing algebra requirements holding a lot of kids back, keeping them out of an auto mechanics class. You don't need algebra for that. Now, one thing I learned in all of the work that I did with big meat packing plants, and if you want to see some of the equipment I designed, you can look up Beef Plant Video Tour with Temple Grandin. We're not showing that tonight. You can see some equipment that I designed. It's in all the big plants. And I worked with a lot of skilled tradespeople, brilliant machinery designers, and the 20% of these people were probably either dyslexic, autistic, or ADHD, and they were brilliant. And some of those people today own big businesses. Yes, yeah, the special ed department builds the stuff. And one of the big problems we've got today is kids in school are not making things anymore. Okay, now that we're at home, now there's more time to learn how to make things. Home Depot's business is booming right now, booming. Well, let's make the best of that. Then you have the mathematical mind. That's the visual spatial thinker. They think in patterns. And one of the things that's been interesting for me is learning that other people don't think the same way I do. Like some people are highly verbal. And then you take the visual spatial thinker who thinks more in math. I was reading an interesting article called The Trash Nebula. It was in the New Yorker magazine. And it was about engineers trying to design devices that could go up into space and get the bits and pieces of broken satellites out of space so they don't like hit the space station like a meteorite. Really bad results. And a camera had been attached to their device, and they could watch it in action, trying to either harpoon a piece of a broken satellite or throw a net around it. And the engineers got glued to their phones watching these videos, because in the past they'd only thought about it as mathematical diagrams, charts, vectors, and mathematical things. They had never thought about what these devices would look like. But the thing is, we need both kinds of thinkers, and they have skills that complement each other. We've lost the ability to build a big food processing plant for poultry. I visited a great big plant last year, and all the equipment that went inside came from Holland. That's the price we're paying for taking skilled trades out of the schools 25 years ago. We don't know how to build a poultry processing plant anymore. Now, we still did the building, we still did the refrigeration equipment, but we didn't do all the clever things that go inside. There's two parts of engineering. There's the more mathematical part, and then there's the industrial design part. That's the visual thinking part. And then there's some people that are mainly auditory thinkers. But there's scientific research that shows that these different kinds of minds actually do exist. Object visualizer and the visual spatial. Let's go to the next slide, please. Well, I went and had some brain scans, and it turns out that I've got some really big visual thinking circuits. And we can just go on to the next one. That was kind of interesting to see that. There's another picture of my visual thinking circuits. And we can go on to the next slide. But the one thing I don't have is working memory. If I was a computer, I'd be a 286 Intel chip. In other words, a very, very small working memory. But memory for graphics files. I have a huge memory for pictures. So some of the people that are different don't load that working memory. Any task that involves a sequence, I need to make myself a pilot's checklist. I get confused with some of the really awful interfaces on these video conferences. I can tell you there's a reason why Zoom is popular. I did not have to learn how to use it. And there's something else called StreamYard.com. I didn't have to learn how to use that one either. Now that's a good interface. The engineers tend to put too many options on it. I was reading an interesting book about Steve Jobs and Wozniak working on the first computer, and Woz wanted to put 8 different circuit board ports on the computer. Jobs is going, no, just put the internet connection slot and the printer slot. Otherwise, it's going to be too complicated for the regular consumers to use. He was right. Let's go to the next slide. Now, how do you figure out what kind of a thinker a person is? The visual thinkers, they'll show up probably when they're 6, 7, or 8 years old. They love art. They'll like building things. If they are exposed to things like fixing cars, they're going to have good mechanical ability. The math thinkers, usually good at math. These are kids you need to expose them to computer programming. Silicon Valley, they're hiring right now. And there's cool things that you can find for kids online. Like you can find out that in the Dragon spaceship that went up to the space station, the touch screens are programmed with JavaScript. That's the same thing that makes the Minecraft video game work. And then you've got the verbal thinkers. They often love facts, but it's pretty easy to figure this out. Now, I'm a big believer in take the thing the kid's good at and build on it. Because a lot of these kids that think differently will be good at one thing, terrible at something else. Yes, I've got to get kids reading good enough so they can read the paper, and you can run a business with about 6th grade level of reading. You need to get it up to that level. But if he's super good at math, maybe move him ahead in math. My mother always encouraged my ability in art, and she encouraged me to draw lots of different things. Let's go to the next slide. My grandfather was a co-inventor of the autopilot for airplanes, and he worked with another guy named Haig Antronikian, who was probably autistic. And he had a crazy idea for 3 little coils to sense the magnetic field, and everybody in aviation thought it was stupid. You're supposed to wire the plane's controls directly up to the compass. Well, this is what happened to the plane when you did that. Well, it turned out they were right. It took them 15 years to get it to work. They couldn't figure out why sometimes it didn't work. but they had their workshop in a loft over where they fixed train cars. And when the train cars went underneath their workbench, this thing acted as a metal detector. Well, that really messed it up. So they had to get it out away from the trolleys, and then it worked. Let's go to the next slide. My grandfather was a more mathematical engineer, and Haig Andronikian was probably more of a visual thinker. See, this is where the skills can complement. You know, if you have creative classes in school, a scientist is more likely to get a Nobel Prize. There's actually been research on that. When I was in elementary school, I loved art, sewing, and woodworking. And if I hadn't had those classes, I would have absolutely hated school. But we need to be getting these things back into the schools. And this is stuff that does not work too very well online. But I do have a book called Calling All Minds, which is all my childhood projects. And there's a lot of kids today that don't make things anymore. Like one of the projects that's in my book is making paper snowflakes. Well, we've got kids today that have never done this. When I did a book signing for this book 2 years ago, I found out that about 20 or 30% of the kids in a town near Boulder had never made a paper airplane. They were totally removed from the world of the practical. Now, we need to get these things back into schools, and we'll go on to the next slide. Well, here's the study that showed that the Nobel Prize winner was 50% more likely to have an arts and crafts hobby compared to just some other scientist. Yeah, that's why we need these things. Let's go on to the next slide. Now, when you're weird, how did I sell jobs? How did I get my business started? Well, I had some great mentors. My science teacher in high school, a super good teacher, because what my science teacher in high school did for me is he made studying become a pathway to a goal. See, previously I was a terrible student. I didn't want to study just because mother wanted me to study. But when studying became a pathway to becoming a scientist, then I was willing to study. So once I got out there and I started designing facilities, how did I sell jobs? I sold the jobs by showing my work. When you're weird, you let the work sell itself. You can go to the next slide, show you some of the work. Well, that's the drawing for the dip fat project that was shown in the movie. And I've actually designed the front end of all the Cargill beef plants in North America. And the way I sold that project is I sent Mr. Fielding, who was the head of Cargill at the time, this is back in the late 80s, some of my really nice drawings and pictures of jobs. Just sell the work. That's how I did an interview. Lay all the pictures and the drawings on the table. We can go to the next slide. And that's the drawing right there that I sent to Cargill. That's the drawing I used to sell Cargill. What you want to do is have a 30-second wow. They open it up and go, wow. Now, why do I say you have to touch to perceive? Well, when the industry went from hand drafting to computer drafting in the mid-90s, we started getting very strange mistakes on drawings. Like the center of the circle was not in the center of the circle. And what I figured out was they'd never drawn by hand. The people who did these really bad drawings had never drawn by hand, and they never built anything. They weren't seeing the things that they were drawing. Because one of the things I had to learn, sort of first started doing drafting, is I had to learn how to read a drawing. So I remember getting these great big drawings of the old Swift plant in Arizona, walking around in there and seeing that a square on the floor was a concrete column that held up the roof. I had to learn how to see that. And a lot of the drawings we're getting today, they're not very good. I got a set of drawings last year where all the rebars, the reinforcement rods were left out. It didn't show how to fasten the fence to the floor. I mean, there was a whole bunch of stuff. They were kind of drawing a schematic. And they said, well, it's in the specs. But you got to draw that stuff on the drawing. Let's go to the next slide. And here's some of the pictures I put in the portfolio. That was the project I originally did at the Red River Cattle Company back in '78. And that was one of the pictures that Mr. Fielding got right there. We can go to the next slide. And that's the recreation of the dipping vat project they made for the movie. I love the fact that they duplicated all my projects, really accurately. I just thought that was just so cool that they had all the engineering stuff in there. I really liked that. Let's go to the next slide. And that's my brochure. They had to do photography in black and white in the '70s. It was too expensive to do 4-color printing. You know what you had to do in the 70s to make colored brochures? They had to go through a printing press 4 times. That's why that's black and white. But I made a really nice brochure with black and white pictures. And we'll go on to the next slide. And that was another one of the pictures that went into the package that I sent to Mr. Fielding. Let's go to the next slide. And that's some of the black and white pictures. The first dip vat project, McElhaney Feed Yard. And yeah, I like showing off my jobs. We can go on to the next slide. There's just another picture right there, and we can go to the next slide. Now, what I'm worried is that our educational system is screening out visual thinkers because of strict algebra requirements. I managed to get out of algebra. In '67, when I went to college, it wasn't required. So I got out of it. And I took statistics and probability instead. And I had to be tutored to get through the statistics classes. I got a C as in Charlie in statistics. But the thing I want to show you is that we need our visual thinkers. We need them to prevent messes like Fukushima. When I found out why Fukushima burned up, I'm going, you got to be kidding. You mean you put your super important electrically driven emergency cooling pump in a non-waterproof basement? Like, you got to be kidding. Engineers calculate risk. I can see the water coming in over the seawall, flooding the site. The doors are going to go boom. They're going to get shoved out. Now, what do you think happens to the emergency cooling pump? It drowns with really bad results. Let's go to the next slide. Well, now Boeing Max, they're finally going to get the Boeing Max back up in the air. Engineers like their jargon. The warning was possible impact with terrain. Impact with terrain is engineering speak for crashing. Why don't you just come out and say crashing? You know, that if you don't do what's on this emergency directive, the plane might crash. Mathematicians calculate risk, but I see it. And when the first Boeing Max crashed, I only knew 2 things. The plane was only a few months old. It was a brand new airplane. And I managed to find the flight tracker radar, and it was going up and down like this. It's the only thing I knew. I said, something is really wrong here. The next day I gave a talk and I said, Boeing's going to be in deep poo-poo over this one. And my friend Brad, who was running my book table at that point, he goes, well, how do you know that? Well, I said, I looked at that flight radar and I'm going, why would the plane be going like a roller coaster? Something had to be horribly wrong. It turned out there was. Let's go to the next slide. Then I started looking into it, and you can see the arrow there pointing at the angle of attack sensor. A little tiny thing on the front of the plane. It measures air angle. Normally, it serves as a guide to the pilot, tell you if the plane's stalling, like this. They had wired that directly to the flight controls without telling the pilots. And when a bird busted it off, the computer thought the plane was stalling when it wasn't, and kept shoving the nose down. And the pilot kept pulling the yoke back. Totally bad. I'm going, how could you do this? When I found out what that was, I'm going, you mean you wired the plane's flight controls to something about the size of this, a bird and just break it right off? And the problem is, they did not see it. They did not see the risk. I've read a lot of stuff about this. They simply just didn't see it. That's why you need visual thinkers to go, well, you're nuts if you wire the plane's controls to that thing and you don't tell the pilots. Like, duh. Let's go to the next slide. Well, there's an example of a plant of imported equipment, state-of-the-art pork processing plant that I was in about 3 years ago. It came from French Canada and Europe. We're not making it anymore. I think it's a big problem. Let's go to the next slide. And there's other stuff we're not making either, like the state-of-the-art chip making machine. I'm not talking potato chips here. I mean electronic chip like inside your phone. It's from Holland. And so is some of the best equipment to outfit what's called fulfillment centers, warehouses where you get all your mail order stuff from. Got a lot of conveying equipment. This from Europe. Gets back to, they don't stick their nose up at skilled trades. So who builds that big plane? The visual thinkers do the whole layout and design all that highly mechanized equipment you just saw on that slide. And the math thinkers, they'll do the building, the trusses, the boilers, refrigeration. And what's happening is visual thinkers are retiring. And this has caused some problems during COVID, because as you know, older people are more susceptible to COVID. And they were trying to supervise construction sites over their phones, over people walking around the site with phones, because they didn't want them to get COVID. That's not too great. Let's go to the next slide. Visual thinkers like me, artificial intelligence, ADHD, dyslexia, we're all bottom-up thinkers. So what does bottom-up thinking mean? You take specific examples and you put them in categories. All right, let's look at trying to find over-the-counter drugs that will work for COVID. There's simple over-the-counter drugs and some prescription drugs to save your butt from COVID. But what you're going to have to do is do genomic testing to figure out which people they'd save. That's bottom-up thinking. That's how a computer thinks. There's a computer now that can diagnose melanoma cancer, and the way it was trained is show it 2,000 melanomas, skin cancers, and then you show it 2,000 other skin rashes. It learns to categorize. Concepts are formed from specific examples. Top-down thinkers tend to overgeneralize. Another advantage to being a visual thinker, I noticed detail. So the very first work I did with cattle, I noticed they'd balk at shadows, they'd balk at coat on a fence, things that people were not noticing. I tend to notice a lot of detail. Let's go to the next slide. Well, here are some tips for working for some of the individuals that are different. Don't overload working memory. And I had to learn how to drive. It took a lot longer because I had to get driving the car into motor memory before I did traffic. I did 200 miles on dirt roads, but I learned how to drive. And I'm seeing too many kids that I got a label today. It might be autism, it might be something else, and they're getting too babied. They're not learning basic skills. I'm seeing smart kids that are doing well in school and they've never gone shopping. They don't know how to do a bank account. They're not doing any skills, any life skills. And any task that involves a sequence, I need to write down the steps because I don't have any working memory. And the other thing is, Mother had a very good sense of how to stretch me just outside my comfort zone and getting me to try new things. And we've got to limit all the computer game playing. Now, the problem now with COVID is that for some kids, video games where they talk to their friends is the only way they can socialize. So we got to allow some of that, especially the ones where they talk to their friends. Yeah, and the parents need to make sure it all stays appropriate. But even now, I'm seeing kids, there's still plenty of stuff that kids could get out and do. Let's go on to the next slide. Well, this is my last slide, and then we're going to open it up for a ton of questions, because I find on these Zoom conferences that having more just back and forth discussion is really good. And I think we got to be asking educators, where is a student 10 years after high school? I was working on those DipVat projects 10 years after high school. We got to start looking at where does a kid end up? I know two people that just took welding in school. One owns an international business. He makes things for the cattle industry. Had a single welding class in high school, horrible student, dyslexic, stutterer. Another guy, he took a welding class. He's building all kinds of big stuff now. He just got a corporate jet because he didn't want to croak from COVID. He's flying all around in that now because he's an older person. You know, very, very successful careers. And I'm talking high-end skilled trade. I'm not talking about roofing or asphalt paving or stuff like that. I'm talking high-end skilled trades. Well, let's just get some questions. I'm gonna, otherwise I'm gonna go on the toolbar and I'm gonna pick somebody. Somebody doesn't get a question. You may have turned the video off, but the names aren't turned off.
Okay, Temple, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing the slides then. Okay.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
All right.
Well, don't put me on full screen. I've had internet router crashes. Just leave me little. Don't put me on full screen.
Yeah, I think everybody can maybe handle that differently. So I know that we've kind of said we're going to do it through the chat. Rebecca, I'm wondering if we shouldn't people can turn on.
Why don't we just let people talk?
Yeah. So
unmute your mic and ask me a question.
If you have a question, turn on, your microphone and your video if you would like.
Why don't I start picking somebody?
you know, and we'll go ahead and entertain that.
Just
So-
the thing to keep in mind is that there's all the 100 people are not showing on the screen at the same time. So if you have a question and we haven't seen you wave your hand, you might just have to start talking.
Well, that's okay.
Yeah. So everybody, okay, Neville.
Neville, can you
Hi,
unmute
yes, hi,
yourself?
Neville.
There we go.
Hey guys. So I'm not technically an educator in the normal system, but I often work as a ski coach or something else. And
Well, that's a t-shirt.
I've definitely experienced a lot of the issues that you've talked about in my educational career. How can I help kids in a physical space like skiing advance in the ways that you're talking about?
Well, you're getting them out with it, doing an activity that they can go and do with friends. One thing that's good about skiing is you can socially distance and still do it. You know, lots of times there's been a sports coach that's turned a kid around. Like the lady that does my web page, she's been a soccer coach, and there was one boy that the other teachers didn't know what to do with, and she knew how to handle him. And sometimes a sports instructor can help turn a kid around. Also, if he really likes you, respects you, then you can get him to do some other stuff too, along with the skiing.
Okay. Well, I also work as a software developer as my day job, so it's
okay.
wondering how to combine those two together for the kids that have that potential.
Well, the thing is you might find in working with some of the kids skiing that they might like to try programming. Then get them onto some of the websites and stuff, and they start learning programming. Okay. Show them the JavaScript that runs the Dragon spaceship displays. That's very cool. Now, I tried to do coding back in the Fortran days. That was hopeless for me. It wasn't for me, but some other kid's going to eat this right up, but you don't know until you expose them. In India, right now, I just read an article in Business Week magazine that in India, they're going to be getting coding lessons just for all kids. But they got to try it to find out if they like it. Right. And the thing is, there's so many free resources that, money's not an excuse for not doing it. The books are not very expensive, and you can go to code.org. You're in software. You can start teaching them some of the stuff.
I'm self-taught. I learned while I was driving as a delivery driver. So. And
you learned, but okay, you can tell other people that you learned it as a delivery driver.
Yeah.
You see, my thing. Let's say if I had, let's say it was COVID right now, gigantic mess, and I was 20 years old, but I had the knowledge I have now. I head straight for the Amazon warehouse. And I'd learn every job on that floor, because 15 years from now, I want to design the next one. And I have seen that career path in the meat industry. Somebody come in, do every job on the floor, gravitate over to maintenance, but you got to work your butt off first. You can't just walk in there and tell them how to do stuff. You got to work your butt off. But I've seen people build the new plant addition 15 years in the future. And then you get to play with Legos with a crane. It's a lot more fun with a crane. And I'm absolutely serious.
Yes.
I've worked with heavy construction for 25 years. No, these are reasonable career paths.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Neville. Great question. Stephen Whittington had an observation.
I was doing some research today on the mining industry and the average education of miners. Now, most miners are high school educated, or maybe not even that high, but it's a skilled profession. If you don't do it well, you die. And so I think that probably that says something about the types of skills that people need to survive in certain industries.
Well, the other thing is,
miners are well paid, and what used to be a very dangerous profession is now not even top 20.
But the other thing that you need to do is make yourself versatile in skill trade. Let's say the only thing you know how to do is pipeline welding. Well, you need to learn how to do more than just that, because the problem is that's an industry that's cyclical. Where if you get much more versatile in your welding and where you can just build anything. I mean, I know a guy who's got a small shop, and somebody comes in, they built some electric panels, and they built a barbecue that looked like a pistol, and just clever stuff. And he fixes balconies, broken balconies, to apartment buildings, and then he goes out and builds specialized equipment for the meat industry. You see, he'll always have a job. So knowing what I know now, if I worked in a mine, I want to learn how to fix the trucks. I want to learn as much stuff so if the mine shuts down, I can go over and fix trucks for somebody. In other words, get enough of a generalist so that you can go to another industry and use your skills.
No, and I agree.
Okay, thank
And
you, Temple.
what you said about algebra applies to mining as well. You don't need algebra to be a good miner.
Well, that's the problem. And I'm seeing students kept out of auto shop because they couldn't do algebra. And the thing is, as a visual thinker, it's too abstract. I could do my old-fashioned arithmetic the way it used to be taught in the 50s. Things like, the area of a complex figure, volume of water in a tank. I could do that kind of stuff. But you see, if a particular algebra formula for calculating something like hydraulic fluid flows in certain situations, I could learn that because I could relate that formula back to something real, like a hydraulic system. And I know how to size cylinders, area of a circle, retract, you subtract the rod diameter. I know how to do that. But you see, I see a hydraulic cylinder when I think about that. It's not abstract. But we have a tendency to, but when you look at the jobs now that are recession proof, diesel mechanics, they're hiring right now. And if trucks go self-driving, someone's still got to fix them. You got tons of gadgets on them.
I want to bring up something. I saw this in our local paper at our local high school that, they're having parents lobbying to get the shop classes back.
Well, I think that's
the
good.
trade things aren't there. That's really too bad.
Well, I think it was a big mistake.
There's a kind of a
out, and I didn't realize how much of a big mistake it was until I went to the pork plant that showed. That slide was a picture I took 3 years ago, but then that was a pork plant. Then I went to the poultry plant last year. And I was horrified. Beautiful equipment, beautiful, shipped over here in 100 shipping containers from a high wage country, and it's because we took out skilled trades. Because what's happening is you don't have the little shops forming to turn into the big shops. And the guy that's the two of the people that are flying around in corporate jets, they start out in tiny shops, and they gradually grew their business in something that's specialized, but not so specialized that they have to have some flexibility. I mean, if you learn to weld pipeline welds, that's all you know how to do. I can't hand you a drawing and say, well, build me an electrical box. Or build parts for my dipping vat system.
We're getting questions in the chat.
Yeah, I'm looking at that right now.
Yeah, so.
Want to tackle one of those, Temple?
Well, I'm looking at the agriculture educator. I really liked this. I'm really pleased that they're watching my movie, and they're building a model of a cattle handling facility. I think that's just wonderful. And then also you can draw it on a CAD system too, but I think it's important when you make the model, you see that's an actual thing, because I'm seeing some really bad stuff drawn on computers, and it's usually from people who have never built anything by hand and they've never drawn by hand. I'm going, really? This looks like an oval. It's not a circle. I think there's a big mistake here on this drawing. No, I think that's really good. And I'm concerned that we're losing some of these skills. And some of the people I worked with, they were brilliant. They could just build anything.
Yeah, there's a question from Jen. We could kind of work up maybe, Temple.
Okay, yeah, the people, Yeah, visual thinkers can sometimes see sort of what's going to happen, kind of think about what's going to happen in the future. See, when I developed a very simple way to evaluate animal welfare at slaughter plants by measuring some simple outcome variables, falling down during handling electric prods, and one score is if cattle are bellowing when you're handling them, you're doing something bad. That turned out to be a really accurate way to detect something bad. And it's a very simple scoring system. But you see, as I talk about it, I see it. And these scoring systems are being used, it's being used around the world now. Nothing's abstract. I mean, I see a bird taking that angle of attack sensor off, or maybe a mechanic's ladder bending it.
Yeah, when you mentioned abstract, that made a lot of sense too, because I can't handle like abstract ideas. I took chemistry in high school, and I basically faked my way through it. I didn't understand it. And then finally, like, I took astronomy in college, and then having something to apply it to. So it wasn't just these random numbers and chemical mixtures. When I could apply it to something like spectral photography or something like they use for astronomy, that's when it finally clicked.
Putting it back to something real.
Yeah.
Yeah, you see, for me, in the abstract, but you see, you need to have both, like those engineers in the Trash Nebula article.
Yeah.
Well, they had I thought, a rather dangerous thing inside a box that they took up to the space shuttle. I mean, up to the space station, and I'm going that with a spring harpoon. And I said, I hope those springs aren't compressed. I wouldn't want to see that harpoon coming out of that box and punching a hole in the wall of the space station. Mm-hmm. And the astronauts asked if they could use it for a table. They didn't know what was in it. And they were told no. Well, the spring should have been, I don't know what the situation was, but if that thing worked with a spring, it would have to be not cocked, as far as I'm concerned.
That definitely makes a lot of sense.
Because if it's going to jab into broken satellite outside, I wouldn't want that sticking in the space station. I can see that. And well, the thing that was interesting when I read this article was just a couple of little sentences where the engineers, when they were looking at the videotapes of their thing performing, once it was launched out of the space station, they were just fascinated because they'd never thought about what it looked like before. And they were playing it on their phones over and over and over again. I'm going, wow, they just discovered visual thinking.
There you go. Well, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks for addressing that question. I'm really good at my job because I think forward. Like, so I'm always like, when somebody asks me something that relates to what I'm doing.
What is your job? What do you do?
I work in IT. So I set up Salesforce implementations for people. So it's basically just for tracking account information, customer information, things like this. And you do a lot of automation to it. And so people will ask for things like, oh, we want our system to do this automatically. And sometimes it's a good idea. And other times I'm like, wow, that's a terrible idea, because in the future, you're going to have people doing this. It's going to create clutter. It'll be garbage. So it makes sense.
Well, you see, the other thing that's interesting, I was reading this book called Coders, about the computer coders. So it's just, I'm working on my new book now too. And the hardcore mathematical kind of computer coder like sticks his nose up at the interface. Well, if you have Zoom became popular because it was easy to use. I've been on some of these other awful platforms. And they have to go through training. They use these things, which I really hate. But you see, you need to have both. You need to have that good coding so the system doesn't crash and it can work on a low bandwidth, but you need to have an interface and not have it be complicated.
Yeah, I'm the interface person. So
well, I would be the interface person because I was on a conference to Brazil, and the whole Zoom network crashed in Brazil. The whole thing went down, and they still wanted to hear my talk. So 3 hours later, I got a link to something called StreamYard.com. And I used it just fine all by myself with no training. I managed to log on and get into it. The link was a hot link that worked. And I don't want to be trained to use these things.
Yeah, it should be intuitive.
Well, that's just it. And on the iPhone, I mean, Steve Jobs was the art side of it. So he made an interface. They made an interface that I didn't have to get a PhD in engineering to figure out how to use the phone. Exactly. You see, you have to have both. The interface is important. And then the thing that's interesting is the history of Zoom. the guy, he's made jillions of dollars since COVID started, but he used to work for WebEx. We actually researched him, and he wanted to upgrade WebEx and make it simpler, and they go, no. So he left WebEx and made Zoom.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Those great questions. We're getting some more here. Nancy Best clarified that we do have such classes here in BV. We have the shop classes. Intuitive, the exact word I was thinking of, coming from a programmer of 20 years. Yes.
But you see, you need to have both. And what's happening in science right now is we're getting the math side's kind of taken over, because what I'm seeing in a lot of the journal articles is they'll put, they do like, you got to use RStudio now. If you don't use RStudio in statistics, you're not cool. All this complicated stuff. And then I read the method section of the paper, and they didn't tell me what breed of pig they used and what they fed it, because that can totally change the results. Or there's a cancer study they couldn't replicate because one lab mixed their cells up with a little thing that has a magnet that spins in it, and the other one used some box with water in it that rocked. And that totally changed the results. How they mixed their samples, vigorously or gently. Those things matter. You see, now I see it. I know what a lot of lab equipment looks like, so I see it when I read the methods.
Can I switch this over to some animal questions?
Yes, absolutely.
Temple, when we started this evening, you said you were going to a lamb plant tomorrow.
Yeah, there's a new lamb
like
plant that got built out in Brush, Colorado, and I worked on some of the animal handling design, and I'm going out there tomorrow.
What are the issues that are different with lambs versus cows?
Actually,
like in the
easier
movie?
to handle than cattle because they follow. There's a kind of a species difference. Pigs and cattle, when you work them in the handling facility or even at a feed yard or a ranch, what you want to do is bring small, separate groups up, where with sheep, they can just go in one big continuous flow. They just follow. And another thing about sheep, if there's a shadow on the ground, they jump it, man. They're like popcorn. They'll jump over a shadow.
So, and Christine had a question about some sort of animal. She said, Dr. Grandin, much of your work has been with mammals. What can we learn from insects, birds, and other invertebrates?
Well, birds actually are really intelligent. I just read a new article about birds. They kind of have miniaturized electronics for their brain. And they don't have a frontal cortex the same way we do, but they have another structure that serves as that big association area. And they pack more processors per unit of brain volume. Because birds have to be light in order to fly. And birds are really smart. Even insects can store images of landmarks they've seen in the past. That's been shown. And then you get into what's conscious. Well, you have to have a certain amount of association area where you can take input and output, and you can associate with memories. And
interesting.
But insects can store visual images of landmarks. That's something that's definitely known.
That's fascinating. So Temple, would you mind scrolling down to the bottom of the chat? There's a really good question there, but it'd be easier for you to read it about the musicians.
Well, music and math are related. Music and math are both patterns. I mean, Einstein plays violin, and then he'd get, thoughts about relativity, I think, coming to him. But there's relationships there. And you might have a kid that can do super good at math. The thing is, you've got kids that often get some kind of label. They'll have extremely uneven skills. And we need to put a lot more emphasis on building up the area of strength, whether it be math, music, designing things. I also read a really interesting article about engineers and industrial designers. There was a survey that was done with students in the two different majors. And they showed them pictures of different chairs, ranging from fancy ergonomic office chair, beanbag chairs, a chair that was in the Museum of Modern Art, and you had to rate them on a 1 to 5 scale for aesthetics, functionality, and creativity. Now, I looked at these and I'd ranked a chair that looked like a wood sculpture, high for creativity, functionality low because it would be hard as a rock, and it was aesthetic. And then this chair that was in the Museum of Modern Art, but I didn't know that at the time, I rated it high for creativity. I wrote ick beside it for aesthetics, and for comfort, ick. In other words, in my mind, I separated aesthetics from functionality from creativity. The engineers tended to put the functionality and the creativity together. Form follows function. Or the industrial designer, I see those very separate traits. The chair that looked like it was made out of pieces of a tree. It'd be beautiful in a museum, but it was very creative. I wouldn't want to sit on it, though. So I'm more the mind of an industrial designer. But the thing is, I don't care if you're in the computer industry or in the meat industry, you need the visual side. You also need the math side. What I thought was interesting, all the welders I worked with that were extremely clever, they never touched boilers or refrigeration. They just, well, that takes the mathematical mind. And that's true for every single company. I worked for all the major meat companies. And that was mainly late 70s, 80s, and early 90s. I was in the plants installing center track restrainer systems and working with crews, worked with a number of different machine shops. And I saw that kind of division of the skills every place I went in, all the big places I went in.
Robin actually had a tag question on there too. Would you share a story of how you have helped autistic students in your science classes at CSU?
Well, I've had several autistic students in my class, and they did really well. I think, I really encourage students to get out and try different things. There's a tendency of parents to overprotect. Where I'm seeing a kid that might be doing really well in high school, he's never gone shopping. And then when I confronted the mother about her kid buying something in a store, she started to break down and cry, saying she couldn't let go. And I suggested buying printer paper. Not talking about anything dangerous here. Well, here's the thing about dogs, and I think one of the problems about having dogs on leashes all the time is I don't think they get exposed to enough stuff. We got more problems with thunderstorm phobias, they're scared of the vet, and home alone, ripping the house up, whining and stuff. Yeah, I think they need to sometimes be off the leash, because when I was a kid, all the dogs ran loose in the neighborhood, and we didn't have anywhere near all the behavior problems we got now. We did have a lot of dogs hit by cars. That was the bad side. But puppies chewed things, and that was about it. Because the dogs were out getting socialized. And there's a lot of abnormal behavior in animals that people don't realize how abnormal it is. I had a chance to visit a vet clinic where they do a thing called Fear Free to help pets not be afraid of the vet clinic. Because I did a talk with the Silicon Valley Humane Society animal shelter, and a bunch of people wrote on the Q&A, not on the chat, but on the Q&A, where I could see it, but the audience couldn't see it. So everybody was asking, my dog's afraid of fireworks. My dog's afraid of the vet. My dog eats the house up and he's home alone. Those three things just came up over and over and over again. And we just didn't have those problems. Thunderstorm phobias, that didn't exist when I was a child. Well, Bruce, that's really crazy green video you've got there. That is like really funky. You got a filter on the camera or something?
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I'm going to turn his video off.
Yeah, but it's like kind of weird cool.
Oh, that's kind of.
It's like you are a green moving sculpture. That kind of make out your head and your arms.
Temple, I want to talk about something because I've seen this, and it's about different kinds of minds, and this is really coming from a business guy, I think. I'm trying to remember exactly where I saw this. I think it was Ray Dalio. but he said, he'd like to hire people that differed in the way they thought for his organization, because you just get better solutions. And he's really saying that a lot of corporate entities are recognizing this. You want diversity. You're talking about different kinds of minds. He's talking
Well, that's
about
diversity right there.
different viewpoints, different backgrounds, different countries, different genders, all that. When you bring them together in a team, you have a lot more interaction and you end up with a better final solution when you have.
Well, that's just it. It's like the programmers and the computer interface people. That's an example there of complementary skills. But the first step I say to people is you have to recognize they think differently. And then, like right now, I'm working on this new book with Betsy, and she's super, super verbal. And I have to explain things so she understands it, and I'm understanding how she thinks. And I'll write a rough draft, and then she rearranges it in the most wonderful way. I don't know how she does it. But that's an example of different minds working together. And then there'll be something I didn't explain it right. And I'm like, oh, you didn't understand that. But then I've got to explain it so that she does understand it. And I'm learning like just what's the right amount of explanation. You don't want 3 pages of single file text and what an angle of attack sensor does. That's too much detail for the public. I've got to explain it in 4 or 5 sentences. So I'm learning too. And we're a great team. The skills complement each other perfectly. I write the rough draft, and then she does her magic on it. Then she asks me questions, and I got to add some more information parts of it. She'll cut something out where I made it too long. And yeah, I really like this comment that your dogs are way more social because you take them out, let them play and explore. That's absolutely right. And I think a lot of dogs are having a lot of fear problems because they just don't get exposed to enough stuff. And then they're afraid of everything. And then you get the people that adopt the rescues, and a lot of those dogs have been abused. And I saw a dog at this veterinary clinic that it was a little rescue dog. When it was an 8-week-old puppy, it had been chucked in a ditch, and somebody found it. And in Fear Free, you give it a lot of treats, like really yummy treats. So the front end's all happy, lapping up the treats, and the back end's quivering with the tail between her legs. It had like, the front end was happy and the back end was scared. It was never seen anything quite like that. It wasn't scared like it just lays down flat or something. Well, a lot of animals, when you're trying to figure out behavior problems, you've got to, if you know what happened to them in the past, that can help you figure out some of the stuff that are scaring them. Okay, so computer programs for young adults with speech challenges. Well, you got to give a kid a way to communicate. That's really important. And can an owner make a pet fearful? Absolutely. Yeah, emotions do spread. Okay,
Temple, I had
this is about a Black Angus cattle ranch. Grandson wants to be an electrical engineer, focus on small devices. Well, he needs to be making little electrical projects. See, first of all, I have always already in electrical engineering right now. One thing I recommend, and COVID's really made a mess out of this, and it's recommended to all students, is to do internships. Do career relevant internships. So you're in electrical engineering, you might try an internship at the power company, try that on. Or you might try some of the place working on circuit design or something. And find out what you like, find out what you hate. Try stuff on. Well, I had the lady come up to me the other day and it made me really happy. We had a big snowstorm here that really put out the fires, which has been wonderful. And I was getting out, it was like 8 inches of snow already had fallen. And she comes up to me and she said, well, I first found out I'm autistic. And I asked her what she did. She said, I'm a technical illustrator. And I said, well, how'd you get that job? And she says, well, I was at a party and a scientist was talking about somebody to draw pictures of his insects. And she says, I can draw the bugs. And she's drawing them now. And that's exactly how I got jobs. And then she sent them sample pictures and then she got hired. that made me really happy that for me, being a scientist comes before autism does. Autism is an important part of who I am, but being a scientist, being a problem solver, that comes first. No, but go try different things on. Like I talked to a gate agent down at the airport shortly before COVID shut all my travel off since March 12th. And her daughter was in engineering, and she tried aerospace avionics for airplanes. That's radios for airplanes and communications. And then she tried a tractor company. And she liked the planes better than she liked the tractors. Okay, that's a perfect way to do an internship and try stuff on. Okay, somebody asked about the Asperger's being taken out. I think it was a mistake, because the problem you've got now is you have someone like me with the same label as somebody who maybe can't dress themselves. And I've seen situations where they might have a smart kid in 3rd grade, fully verbal, smart kid in with nonverbal kids, and they need very, very different kinds of services. But I want to emphasize there's some nonverbals that can learn to type independently. And they actually have like a locked-in syndrome. But I think taking that out was a gigantic mistake. Now, I don't care if they changed the name to just autism with no speech delay. You could call it that. It's the same thing. But you've got such a broad spectrum that it's kind of ridiculous they all have the same label. And I think it's a real problem for educators and service providers because they get stuck on the label. And I'm seeing too much of, well, poor little Tommy's got autism, so he'll order his hamburger for him. I go, no, he needs to order it himself. Just these basic things. I was shopping when I was 7 years old. She's okay. Great with kids, trouble with adult coworkers. Yep, I've heard that before. Okay, now the thing, you see, then the whole problem about whether or not to disclose. Unfortunately, there's still a lot of discrimination. About 6 weeks ago, I went to lunch with a guy who had an outdoor technical job. I can't say exactly what he did. It was outdoors and it required understanding some machinery and stuff like that. But he had worked there for 5 years, and he disclosed, and they laid him off. So I never disclosed. Of course, the cattle industry knows now. No, I never disclosed. I would say something, I'm really bad at multitasking. Let me write it down. I disclosed that. I didn't even realize that was disclosure. Get tutoring before you flunk the math class. So I did that. But there's still a lot of discrimination out there. And if you want to go in the military, it's don't disclose. And now then sometimes I remember early when nobody knew, I was at a hog slaughter plant, and the hog buyer had an autistic son, and all he wanted to do was talk about how to educate his son, which I did. But there's still an awful lot of discrimination going on. And if you're doing well in a job, I just wouldn't disclose. I never did. I don't tell people on airplanes. I just say, well, I'm a professor at Colorado State University, and this is what I do. I'll talk about visual thinking and math thinking. I'll talk about that stuff. Well, one thing that was done with me in elementary school that was really good is my teacher did a thing that's now called peer-mediated intervention. And when she would explain to the other children that I had a disability that wasn't visible, like a wheelchair, and that they needed to be helping me. The other thing that helped me is old-fashioned 50s upbringing. When I made a social mistake, it was explained what I did wrong. And then things like crashing and burning with the coworkers, I need to find out what the problem is. Let's leave a sex, religion, and politics, leave it at home. Don't bring that to work, period. And maybe she went on and on talking about just anything. I need to start figuring out what she was doing to get the coworkers so upset. And I made some mistakes, and I fortunately had people telling me, when I worked for the Farmer Ranchman magazine, I'd been there about 3 years, and we got a new boss because the magazine had been sold, and I didn't recognize the warning signs that Jim, the new boss, thought I was really weird. But fortunately, Susan, who did all the graphic designed and laid out the magazine. I think she was on the autism spectrum. And she said, you know what? Jim doesn't like you. And we got to make a portfolio of all your articles. So I made this big scrapbook. I still have it. It's this thick of all my articles. And we showed that to Jim and he gave me a raise. That was an example of showing the work. But if Susie hadn't warned me, I wouldn't have known to do that. You know, this was mid-70s.
So Temple, I have another daughter, and she also keeps losing jobs.
And what's happening at the jobs? And what are the jobs?
See, and that's the thing is she doesn't see that she's the problem. She can't, and I'm not there, so I don't know.
Well, I took the advice. There's a scene in the movie where they slammed down the deodorant and said, "You stink, use it." That happened. And on one of my first building projects, I criticized some welding. I said it looked like pigeon doo-doo. And Harley, the engineer, pulled me into his office and made it very clear that was not acceptable. He told me what I should do, and I followed the advice. And then I started making some rules. I can talk about that movie twice. I can talk about the worst vomit flight in the world twice, and then drop it. That's one of the things I learned.
Yeah.
Now my funny thing is showing what are airlines doing so they don't go broke. They haul cargo. You can look up passenger airline cargo, and it shows boxes strapped in seats with seat extenders on some Japan Air. Cargo in seats. I don't know. But okay, so that's funny to show that to somebody. But if I showed that to somebody twice a day for a week, they get bored with it.
Yeah.
And I had to learn not to do stuff like that.
Temple, I think one thing that's a reality for my daughters, we are a polite society. And so their coworkers aren't willing to be candid with them. So I don't think
what you have to do is, like Carly, the engineer, pulled me in the office and says, "You can't talk that way. And you're going to have to go up and apologize to Whitey the welder. He's in the cafeteria right now. You go up and apologize." He made me do it. And he told me very calmly in private what I should do. He was a perfect job coach. Harley Winkleman, Swift plant engineer.
I need to send my daughters to him.
Yeah, but I mean, he did absolutely the right thing.
Yeah.
And we got to find out what she's doing at work. What were the jobs, first of all? What were they?
Well, one of them is an early childhood educator, and the other
is with little kids. Then probably gets along great with them.
Right, but she's not adept with her peers.
Well, and got to find out exactly what she's doing wrong.
Yeah, I know.
And then talking on and on and on about the same thing, having real extreme views on stuff. Does she do that? What do you think she does?
Yeah. I have some guesses, but I don't know.
Well, what do you think she does? Let's be specific here.
Well, one of them would talk on and on about bizarre, extreme, opinions, and
like that's what is that? A comic book or something? I don't know. Bizarro thing.
Conspiracy theories.
Oh, you need to drop that garbage. Yeah, this is the kind of crap you don't bring to work. It's just that simple.
Yeah.
And
then my other daughter.
Pets. Okay, pets are real safe. Sports is safe. You can be on opposing sports teams. That's safe.
My other daughter is highly reactive emotionally. And she misses social cues.
I used to miss social cues. So what kind of problems is that causing at work?
She's perceived as awkward, as annoying, I think.
And what is the job she does? What does she do?
So that's the daughter who's the early childhood educator. The daughter who
one's a childhood educator. Now, you see, I had a job. What saved my job was when Susie, the graphic designer, had me put together this big portfolio. And Jim looked at all my articles and go, "Oh, no, give her a raise." You see, I was in a field where I could show off work. I could show off magazine articles I'd written, and I could show off things I had designed and drawings. I could just lay the work out there. And I knew better than to talk about stuff that would just make people mad.
My other daughter works really well with animals, but
Okay.
she didn't succeed in the corporate setting. And
Wait a minute, what she's working with animals, what's she doing in a corporate setting?
well, she was working for the Dumb Friends League in Denver.
Okay.
Yeah, and but that didn't work out, even though it seemed
Well, wait
like
a minute, what was she doing in the corporate? If she just works in the kennel, she shouldn't even be in the corporate office.
No, it wasn't the corporate office. I think I just meant a big organization. That's what I meant.
So that she didn't get along with the other people at the animal shelter then.
You know, I'm just not
See,
sure.
this is where to solve these problems, we got to get really specific. Let's
Yeah.
just leave the conspiracy theories at home and along with the politics and the other stuff. Leave it at home. You don't bring that stuff to work, period. That's a rule.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
that simple.
Temple, can we look at this last question?
Okay, all
What are
right.
some
Thank you,
recommendations
Temple.
you have? What are some recommendations you have for explaining this to other teachers who may not be as receptive or understanding of students with autism?
Well, that's when I
or
started
other
telling them that
disabilities?
Einstein probably had autism, and they're using a computer that was probably made by somebody that has autism. We wouldn't have any technology without autism, because our brain can be more cognitive or our brain can be more social emotional. It's just like the solitary mammals. And a little bit of autism makes a great computer programmer. And I've been out to Silicon Valley. Half those programmers, I know they're on the spectrum. They totally avoid the labels. They avoid them like the plague. And one of the things that helps is show what the kid can do. Super good at math, he'll tend to get respect for that. Super good at art, but then you cannot be a rude, filthy slob. And when that manager threw the deodorant down and said, "You stink, use it," I was really upset at the time. I thank that manager now. No, you got to clean it up. You can be eccentric, but you can't be a filthy, rude slob. That has to change. And I had to learn not to just run it into the ground talking about the same stuff all the time. I think it's funny putting boxes on airplane seats with seat belt extenders. I got some good laughs out of people, but we might look at that twice and then it's something else. We were giggling about that today. I was showing that to Cheryl today. But I don't think Cheryl's going to want to see those pictures 10 times. I had to learn not to do that kind of stuff. But I just thought it was kind of funny, the idea of boxes traveling as passengers.
All right. Well, Temple, I'm going to turn this over to Greg Reed. He's a board member. So, Greg, I'm showing you still being muted there.
There we go. Hello. Hi, Temple. I'm Greg Reed. I'm a member of the Collegiate Peaks Board, and we would like to thank you for being our speaker tonight. The board and all the attendees who joined us remotely this evening appreciate you taking the time to share your insights and expertise with us.
Yeah.
The board would also like to thank everyone who joined us this evening for their support of the Collegiate Peaks Forum Series talks. A list of the sponsors and donors can be found on our website. We look forward to our next season and hopefully a return to in-person talks in Buena Vista, Leadville, and Salida in 2021. Thank you again.
And I didn't have to do any Independence Pass.
No, ma'am, you do not.
Nope, I don't. I will never go up there ever again. Too scary for me. No, it's good to talk to everybody, and we've got to start getting the attitude of what a student can do. And one of the things that helped with my weirdness is that my articles that were not weird. I got a reputation of when I covered that Arizona cattle feeders meeting, it was covered accurately. I do a feature on a dairy, it was a really good feature. And when I got respect for the design work that I did. See, that's where I learned to sell my work. Now you see, it's easy to make a portfolio. Now, childcare worker might get some video of how working with kids. Now you have to get permission from the parents to do that. A little bit more difficult, but there's certain rules you have to start learning. And then you won't lose the job. You may not be loved by your coworkers, but you'd at least be tolerated. Make yourself really, another problem I've seen is the person with autism might get along really well with one boss. Then they get a new boss, and this is what happened with the magazine. I almost lost that job. Thank you, Susie, because I didn't see the warning signs. She says, you got to get this portfolio together, and we did.
Well, again, thank you very much, Temple.
Okay, well, great to talk
Thanks
to you.
to you all for coming.
Okay.
This event has been recorded and it
Oh,
will be
and by the
available on
way,
our
I've got
website.
books. Oh yeah, if you're working with autistic kids, this is my most basic book on autism, the way I see it. Lots of little short articles. This is my autobiography. Now we'll do the book sales. Thinking in pictures. And this explains the autistic brain, explains the different kinds of minds.